Hello and welcome to the paraphrasing exercise. I'm Shannon McGregor, your English instructor. Let's get started on discussing the differences between quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing, but with a heavy focus on the paraphrasing act. First, we need to talk about direct quotations and actually finding a resource. So you all have a work that you're studying for class, and that might be an essay that you're responding to, or it might be, you're supposed to read some journals or books and find information from those in order to work into a paper. And so whatever your assignment actually is, you would be reading some information and then recording that information. And that's what direct quote, summary, and paraphrase allows us to do, is to take somebody else's ideas and represent it in our own work in a fluid manner. And so the first item that we're going to talk about is a direct quotation. Direct quotations are meant to be words or phrases that are taken directly, word for word, from the resource. So you're reading this book or you're reading this essay, and you see something that really strikes you that you could base or that you could support an argument in a paper about. And so maybe this information is really well worded, well phrased, or maybe it was stated by somebody who's important to that particular topic. You decide, oh, I want to take this information word for word from this resource. And so you record it in your paper. When you record that in your paper, you must then surround those words, every word that author said exactly as they said it, with quotation marks. And you can't miss a quotation mark here. You must have a starting quotation mark at the very beginning of the phrase or the sentence that's being recorded. And you must also have one at the end of the passage or of the words that are being recorded from that source. To omit either one is to plagiarize, because how does the reader know, without one or the other of the quotation marks, where your language begins and ends, where the quote or source's information begins and ends? And again, when you pick up and start writing again, how do they know where that starting and stopping point is? They don't. So you provide a quotation mark at the beginning and a quotation mark at the end of the passage so that it's clearly marked, hey, I got these words from a specific resource. And when you finish a quote, then you should always include a citation at the end of the quoted material. And that citation is typically in the form of an author and a page number. Right now I'm going to show you a direct quote in one of the worksheets that I give to my students. In this direct quote 1 area, you will notice that this information is taken word for word from a specific resource. And this information is surrounded at the beginning and at the end by quotation marks. So this resource, all these words are from this original resource, and it's word for word from that resource, and it's surrounded in quotation marks. The last point on the previous slide mentioned an in-text citation, and so that's what this is. Gregory, 290, all of that works together to point to a works cited entry for Dick Gregory's Shame. It happens to be an autobiographical essay or piece that's in our textbook. And if we find Gregory's piece in our textbook and we look on page 290, then we will find these exact words on that page. So that illustrates the idea of having that source actually cited with the material and shows you a direct example with a direct quote. The final piece to a direct quotation is to always remember that you have to place that entry in the works cited page, which appears at the end of the paper. It's in the same file. It's the last page of the document that contains the works cited page. And so Gregory leads us to the text where we found Dick Gregory's Shame in our previous example. All right, so I'm going to poo-poo my previous example just a little bit there were several sentences in that direct quote. And when you're quoting, if you were to include that many sentences, there'd be a problem. It would look like you are padding your paper. What you would want to do is to look only at the sentences or phrases that actually prove your point and help you support your argument. So students should always avoid quoting more than one or two sentences in their direct quotations. And I'm going to attribute the second bullet point here. The reader wants to read what you think or your analysis, not a patchwork of your sources writing. I'm going to attribute that to Dr. Nancy Caldwell, who was an English instructor, who was a music instructor at the college where I previously taught. And she had that great description. She said, when I'm reading a music paper and I just see quote after quote after quote, or especially block quotes, lengthy quotes, what do instructors think? You're padding your paper. You're just kind of piecemealing this paper together rather than actually thinking about how those quotes work and operate in the paper. You're just plopping quotes in there just to be able to either meet a length requirement or just so that you can use the resource, but you're not really integrating the resource. So by limiting quotes to only one or two sentences helps a student really think about what else he or she has to say about that information. So it forces the student into writing more. And you don't want to piggyback the quotes. And by piggybacking, I mean have quote after quote after quote either in that paper. So making sure that the quotes are truly integrated and making sure that around the direct quote that the writer has included his or her analysis or own thinking about that quote or point about what's being stated in that paragraph and illustrated by that quote. That's what a writer's supposed to do. So make sure that you avoid quoting more than one or two sentences. And just to go back to this quote, if my paragraph where I want to put this quote is actually all about food or is all about the idea of the hungriness, I would pick out the couple of sentences that really illustrate that or the points that really illustrate that. These last statements really have to do with hunger. And if I were to kind of partner, his first comment, Dick Gregory's first comment about I was pregnant with poverty, and one of those signifiers or portions of poverty that is very strong is that idea of hunger. And so I was pregnant with poverty, pregnant with hunger. Paste don't taste too bad when you're hungry. Those comments placed in a paragraph about hunger would be so phenomenal. Absolutely the perfect addition to that paragraph. And the final comment that I want to make about direct quotes is at the bottom of this slide. Quotation marks and quoted passages should be reserved for the opinions, analysis, or discussion of recognized scholars or authorities. In other words, when you're going through research, if the person is important to the study, is a well-known scholar within that field, that person's quote-worthy. It could be important that you not only use their name in a sentence itself, but also use their words. The other test that I offer, or that I give myself when I'm writing a paper is, could I say this any better? Or is this so well phrased that the comment will really hit my reader in a way that I don't know that I could necessarily think about? If that's the case, if it's a well-known scholar or if it's really well phrased, then consider using the quote. If it's not, if the quote does not fit either of those, then you need to do what the rest of this presentation is about, and that's paraphrase, put it into your own words. As a rule of thumb, you should use only one direct quote per page and no more than that. So with a 4-page assignment, using 4 quotes in the paper would be reasonable. What I see too often is that I have 3 or 4 quotes on one page, and on the next page we've got another 3 to 5, and then, that's too many other people's information. You need to be responsible, or I as the writer need to be responsible for what I am putting into my paper. So what do we do in the paper if we don't quote, if we're only reserving quotes for, well-known scholars or something that is particularly well phrased? Then, what do? We want to use this other information from these other people, but how do you get that into your paper without directly quoting? The answers are paraphrasing and summarizing. And paraphrasing and summarizing are similar in a few ways. They are both condensed versions of the resource. They are both cited parenthetically at the end of the information that's been borrowed, just the same as a direct quote. When you're paraphrasing or you're summarizing an idea from another person, that doesn't magically make it your idea. You still have to cite that it comes from that other resource. And so you have to have a parenthetical citation or a citation in the sentence itself. And you also have to have an entry in the works cited page that people could follow up, go find that book, go find that journal article or that newspaper article, and actually read the piece that you're citing. So let's talk about how they're different now. With summary is a smaller version of a large-scale work, such as a book, an article, a chapter. It might be that you write a summary for a book report. Actually, that's one of the primary components of a book report, is that you would summarize the text and then you would pick out the main points for analysis. Something that you might be more familiar with is, if you've seen a movie review on TV, as you're looking at the movie review, what does that reviewer have to do? They first have to tell you about the movie. They have to clue you into the major pieces of the plot, to the main characters, to what the themes are of that particular movie. And usually those things appear, in a brief paragraph or a brief description, maybe, 5 or so sentences worth of material. It might be a little longer depending upon the movie as to how much time or if you're writing a movie review, how many paragraphs you offer. But typically it's done in one paragraph that is relatively brief, just enough to hit the main points of the movie. But that's not what you're doing in a majority of the papers that you're going to be writing. You're primarily going to be providing analysis for the papers that you're writing for most of your classes. So summary would not be an appropriate method to use in all papers for all of your classes. And if you're in doubt, you need to ask your instructor. It's typically appropriate only when a boss or an instructor requests the summary. And so, for example, in my assignments, if I wanted you to actually summarize a work, I would tell you, I would put it into the actual outline of the paper that, hey, you're supposed to summarize right here. And typically that's the second paragraph. Right after the introduction, you clue in your reader to, what that work is about, and then you move on. But in all honesty, for literature papers, I don't want any summary. You can assume, for the most part, that your audience has read that work, and you're going to focus your time on actually picking apart the pieces of the play or of the short story or whatever you're studying. So you don't need to summarize in most situations. In a research paper, you are the writer and analyst, and so paraphrasing is really what you're going to want to do. So let's cover what paraphrasing is. What is paraphrasing? It's when the writer changes the words from the direct quote into his or her own way of phrasing. And so where you're writing a paragraph and then you pop in a quote, typically, instead of that quote, you're going to have that paraphrase. My way of phrasing, it's the writer's way of phrasing that material, and so it's going to be a lot more smoothly integrated into the paper. It's not going to be like you have the writer's voice and then you have this resource and then you have the writer's voice again and then the resource again. It's this smoothness that paraphrasing really provides to a paper. The writer does not copy words, phrases, sentence structure, or logic from the original. It is completely worded. reworded from the resource. And I'm going to talk about a few exceptions to that here in just a little bit. But for the most part, what you want to do is not write down the quote and then look to a thesaurus to replace a few words in there. That's how a high schooler or junior high kid would end up paraphrasing. What you want to do is you want to take the ideas from that quote, think about it, think about what has to be represented from this quote, and you put it into your own words. So that gets you away from copying the sentence structure or copying the logic from the original piece. It helps you focus on what's important to your argument. And with that said, you're changing a lot of words, right? So bullet point number 3, the writer cannot take the words or the materials out of context. When you're representing that quote in a paraphrase, you still have to keep the original context. So if you're trying to make it sound like you want it to in order to support your argument, then what you're doing in your paper is lying. And so you need to make sure that you're keeping that quote and its original meaning and intent intact. And maybe if you need to do a little bit of massaging, then you do that with the analysis right after you have paraphrased. So the paraphrase actually rephrases and uses the main ideas from the quotes, but it's put into that writer's words and it's kept in context to the original wording of the resource. And the last thing to think about with what is paraphrasing is that the paraphrasing only changes 1 or 2 sentences of the quoted material into 1 or 2 sentences of a paraphrase. If you're thinking about summary, you're taking an entire movie or an entire book that's many, many chapters, and you're condensing it down to a paragraph. That's a high ratio. That's like a 100-to-1 ratio in some contexts, with how summarizing works. With paraphrasing, though, it's really the length of the paraphrase is very similar to the length of the direct quote. So you're really closely representing what was in the original quote. You might have 2 sentences from the quote and be able to get it down to 1 sentence in the paraphrase. That's okay. But typically you're doing kind of if I have 2 sentences here, I have 2 sentences here. If I have 1 sentence here in the quote, I have 1 sentence in the paraphrase. You want to keep it as close and as tight to the original as you possibly can. To do any more than just a couple of sentences, though, is to get in too close to summary. And so keeping the quotes small and keeping the paraphrases pretty brief, too, is important. Paraphrasing, like summary and like direct quotes, is from another resource. So paraphrasing must be cited. It needs to be cited in the sentence or at the end of the statement in a parenthetical citation. And it also has to be cited in the works cited page. To omit either the parenthetical citation from the paraphrase, the summary, or the direct quote, or to omit a citation for that resource in the works cited page, is to plagiarize. So if you forget, oops, I forgot to put the author page citation in the paper where I use that quote or paraphrase or summary, I've plagiarized. If I forget to put in my works cited page, I've plagiarized. It doesn't matter your intent, whether you accidentally forgot the citation or whether you just didn't put it in there. The intent is not important here. It's an academic integrity breach, and it is plagiarizing. You're not recognizing that information comes from that other resource. So I can't stress this enough. You have to cite all 3, direct quote, summary, and paraphrasing. You have to tell where that source is from, both in the paper and in the works cited page. Okay, so I told you that there would be some exceptions to completely rewords from the previous slides on paraphrasing. The exceptions to the rule would be when you have numbers. And so you're not going to change the number 59% from numbers to letters, or spelling out that particular number. You're not going to do that. That would be silly. It'd be ridiculous. So making sure that the numbers are preserved is just fine. Now, if you wanted to say nearly 60% when you have a number, that would be okay. But why would you need to change the number? It doesn't make sense. And as a general rule with rounding, if it's over 5, if you have like a decimal point and it's like 59.6%, you could round that up to the next number. But if it's like 59.4, you can't round that up. You need to represent 59% or 59.4%. You can't change that around to fit the numbers the way you want them to. And you certainly can't take it up any higher than just that number. You have to represent numbers regularly. So essentially what I'm saying here is, if you see a number in your quote, just put the number in your paraphrase. Don't worry about rewording it and trying to avoid plagiarizing. Use the numerals 2, 6, if that's what you found in the original quote. Just use 2, 6. And the last comment that I'll make about the numbers is that MLA, APA, journalistic styles, the different writing guides will tell you what numbers you need to spell out and what numbers you need to keep in numerical form. And it's all depending upon the discipline for which you're writing. So if you are writing a science paper, they are far more likely to let you get away with using the number 3, because typically numbers 0 through 10 are spelled out always in different disciplines. But in scientific and math-related fields, they actually use the numeral 3 instead of spelling out the word 3. So that's it. The only other caveat that I have. So read your style book, in other words. Number 2, proper nouns. Proper nouns would be cities, would be names of people. And so wouldn't it be pretty silly in a professional or an academic paper to call New York City the Big Apple? It's informal. It's not appropriate to that particular forum. Now, if you're speaking, to a less formal audience, or, if it's in kind of a pop culture reference or song or something like that, then it might be appropriate to do that. But for academic papers, you're going to make sure that if the author in the original source used New York City as the city where such and such happened, then you're going to be able to state New York City. You don't have to reword New York City in order to use it in your paraphrase. Use the actual term. And the same thing for names. If you've got a person, if you've got a place, if you've got a specific location, you're not going to change the name of that just so that you don't plagiarize. You're going to keep the proper nouns in their original form. Number 3 is discipline-specific terms, which might need just a little bit of explanation. If you look at your paraphrasing exercise worksheet, you'll see several examples there. But essentially that discipline-specific words are words that are particular to a field. So they have to be used in that field in that specific way. So if a doctor was trying to talk to you about a heart condition and kept referring to, cardio in some way, that's of the heart. And you're not going to change cardio just so that you don't plagiarize necessarily, unless it's more appropriate to your audience. So this is where an audience concern comes in. But quite frankly, if I have some cardio issues, I'd rather that the doctor just told me that. Or if I have some respiratory issues and, breathing issues and lungs issues, I would rather have them use that word so I know specifically what we're talking about. If I don't know what I'm talking about, then I can look it up in the dictionary when I get home. But you're not going to change up those words just to be different, just so that you don't plagiarize. If you're going in for radiation treatment, there are not very many other words that you can refer to that kind of treatment. I mean, just think about that, radiation treatment. There might be a specific machine that they're using or whatever, but pretty much it's called that. It's that term is the appropriate one to use. And to think of a few examples from other disciplines. In my literature class, I will discuss deconstruction with my students. And deconstruction is a very specific literary term that helps analyze a text. It's one of many ways of analyzing a text. And so if I'm discussing deconstruction, I'm not going to change that term because then it would mean something else. I have to use that term in reference to what it is. So making sure that you're keeping consistent, that you're using the actual discipline-specific terms. You can use those in your paraphrases. Just don't go overboard. If you can think of a better word, think of it and go for it. The last thing is not really a, it is a completely words and it's not. So I kind of have to separate it here for a second. And I want to get across this idea of what is common knowledge. Do you have to cite common knowledge? Typically, you do not have to cite common knowledge. And for example, to mention that Abraham Lincoln wrote and spoke the Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War, that's something that is historical in nature and is kind of an American's common knowledge understanding. So you wouldn't need to cite that. But bullet number 2 here, it cannot be copied from the source. You can't just read an encyclopedia or a book or a journal article and see that sentence in there and then copy it word for word. You still have to put it into your own words. So making sure that you do that is very important. And I'll go back to that first bullet point. To give you a guide on common knowledge, in general, if you can find the information in 4 or more resources or multiple resources, then you can probably consider that common knowledge. If you're in doubt, you need to ask your instructor. Because it will depend upon who your audience is. It will depend on the type of information that you're actually documenting. So if in doubt, just either cite it or ask your instructor or somebody within the field whether they think that information should be cited. And the other comment that I want to make about if the information is viewed in multiple sources, I kind of like to go away from that idea a little bit because too often people will copy off of each other on the internet. They'll just swipe their web content and put it into their own site as if that makes it true, and it's not necessarily. So you want to make sure that you're looking at responsible resources. I could say anything. I could make up a fact, and if 4 other people commented upon it, that would make it common knowledge technically. So you need to use your reason with that. Yes, 4 or more reliable resources could make that common knowledge. So just really consider that. And that is to say that common knowledge could be cited if a resource proves valuable to understanding the material. A couple of years ago, I had a student who was writing a paper about addiction, and it gave the typical physiological and some of the psychological things that addiction would do, but a definition that the student found in one of the encyclopedias in the library was just so phenomenal that about addiction is not just the physiological changes that a person's body goes through when they're addicted to nicotine or addicted to meth or addicted to alcohol or whatever. It's a psychological approach that helps the person, or addiction is a psychological condition where a person is actually involved in and tied to that concept of addiction. It was such a unique way of looking at addiction that she said, okay, the definition of addiction would absolutely be common knowledge. But this guy said it so well. Could I quote and cite this resource? And I said, of course. If you gained insight from that resource, why not give him the props for that? Why not absolutely say, hey, if you want to really understand this concept, go to this resource. So if you think it's a really good description or that it's unique or valuable in some way, go on ahead and cite it. Don't even wishy-wash about is it common knowledge or not. Just cite the resource. It's not going to hurt anything. And if you're oversighting things that are considered common knowledge, your boss or your instructor is going to kind of say, you know what, you could get away with killing some of these citations because those are really common knowledge. They're going to be honest with you. All right, so let's look at this to see if this is quoted well. We have this original direct quote, it was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. That was Susan B. Anthony's quote. And I'll show you the works cited entry here in a little bit, but she's the one who made that quote and made that comment. She was a suffragette in the 1800s. Suffragette meaning she was a woman fighting for women's right to vote. So that's a quote that I might use in one of my literature papers. And if I were trying to paraphrase this, I would try to represent the most important parts. And so one of the things that we need to do is determine, is this quote paraphrased or is it plagiarized? Or is this paraphrased or is it plagiarized? So if you will get out your paraphrasing exercise and look to page 2, at the very top of the page, you will see what's called a paraphrase check. You're going to ask the following questions to each paraphrase written. First, did I copy words, phrases, or sentence structure, anything from the original quote, into the paraphrase? And so we're going to be judging this quote here at the top of the screen versus the attempt at paraphrasing at the very bottom of the screen to see if there were any words or any phrases or any logic or anything that was copied. And so if I'm looking through here, I'm looking for major concepts. Do I see the same sentence structure here in the paraphrase? Can I compare it to this one up above? Ooh, I see something. Let me switch to my pointer. I see the word citizens both here in the paraphrase and up here in the direct quote. Let's see. I see the word union right here, and I see the word union up here. All right. I think that might be a majority of the potential plagiarism that's happened. Okay, so let's talk about these terms for a moment. The word citizens, that's copied in both of them. What other words would be appropriate for citizens? Well, residence is not right because the word resident doesn't hold the actual value to vote and to be able to have a lot of the same rights and privileges. You know, a citizen gets certain privileges, and a resident might just live there, might be a permanent resident or might be a temporary resident. You don't know. So it doesn't mean the same thing. Can I think of another word? I don't know. Do I need to? I think what we might have here is an example of a discipline-specific term that's particular to that concept or to that field. So, you know, maybe it's not so bad to use the word citizen, because if I were to use the word residence, I would change the context of the quote, and I don't want to do that. So let's look at that again. No, all the citizens, if I were to put in something else, it would mean something different. So I'm going to leave that one in there. Union. Do I have to use the word union? What else could I mean there? Well, if you're thinking of the 1800s, then union would be appropriate because, you know, you have the North and the South and the Union Army and the Confederate Army. And the United States back then was referred to as a union. So it is appropriate. But, you know, to be truthful, it's kind of antiquated, isn't it? So I could probably go on ahead and change that one. So I would want to mark on my paper, yeah, I really do need to use that. I do need to change union. So I'm going to say citizens is okay, and I'm going to make sure that I have noted that union actually does need to be changed. If we look to the paraphrase check one more time, so I've checked for words that I've copied, possibly. I think I've passed the test there. I'm okay with what I actually recorded there. So let me go to the next criteria. Did I maintain the context of the original quote, or did I change it so much I lose the context? What do you think? Don't you kind of think that I've overdone it here? I've really slipped into analysis instead of actually paraphrasing, because up above here, let me erase my other highlights for me to change. It was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. She's talking about gender differences, and she could be talking about race issues, but I don't see race in there anywhere. I see gender issues. Male citizens, it was we the people, not we the white male citizens. Well, white's in there, but the truth is that she's really kind of focused on women's issues here. So maybe I need to back off a little bit. Let me get my pointer here again. Maybe I need to back off on some of this comment. No matter the gender, race, or social status, maybe I need to just say what she means here. So I could probably revise and take some of this information out. What would be good information? Let me erase. All right. Okay, what could I keep in here? I think that the Founding Fathers of the United States is nice information, but I'm not so sure that it is necessary. I could find another way to say that. I don't have to overdo it there. So I might say, I think I really do want to focus on women's issues. So I could look at this: search for freedom, women who are citizens of the United States, and so I would need to write that in there, should be considered in the rights to vote, assemble, speak freely, and other rights described in the Constitution. Now, I might say that that's actually overdoing it a little bit too, but you know what? What rights do people go to in the Constitution immediately? Those first and second rights that people just reference all the time. And so thinking about the right to vote, to assemble, to speak freely, those concepts are what they were really arguing for the ability to be able to do. I could probably get rid of assemble. So let me go in here and just erase that concept, because she really wasn't focusing too heavily upon that. She was really focusing on the right to vote and to be able to communicate as an equal. So the rest of the stuff I could probably get rid of, and I could really focus in on women. So that would keep the original context of the quote intact. Maybe we could rephrase it as something like, that even with the writing of the Constitution, the male authors forgot about the women or omitted the women from the citizenship. And Susan B. Anthony was trying to write that. We could get a concept in there about that would work. We have 2 more checks to do from this paraphrase check. And so, yeah, I did overdo it with the context of the quote. So, yeah, I reworked that. I've worked it out. But the last 2 parts are, did I provide an in-text or parenthetical citation? And did I write a works cited entry for this resource? Let's check that out. All right, so here on this slide, let me get rid of my other eraser marks. So here on this slide, in both positions, we have an actual citation of an author and a page number. So if I go to, let me go back to my arrow. If I go to the works cited slide, what do I see here? I see a citation for Susan B. Anthony, and I could go and find that book in a library, and I could absolutely see what her original context was for her quote, for the passage that I actually used there. So my in-text citation directly ties into my works cited entry. Thank goodness my citations were correct there. So, have we answered the idea of, is this paraphrased or plagiarized? Well, it is not plagiarized because we didn't take too much, and we're going to change that idea of union. We're going to get rid of that idea of union in here. So we could say, well, this is definitely not plagiarized, but it might be a little overdone. It is paraphrased, but we really want to rail it back a little bit. And that's what I find students often do when they're trying so hard not to just substitute words in, that they really overdo the paraphrasing and take things out of context a little bit. So don't let that be you. All right. Well, here's my works cited entry, and you can see that there's another citation on here. One of the things that I want you to do is to make sure that you take that in-class writing assignment, the Clement article that's in your paraphrasing exercise. If I look down my paraphrasing exercise, I have an actual quote, again, that I could practice with. If we examine this quote and we look at the pieces of it to see, okay, what do I need to paraphrase and what don't I need to paraphrase, we could look at this and say, Federal Agency of Healthcare Research, we won't need to paraphrase that because that is a what? It's a proper noun. Absolutely. Medicare is also a proper noun, and it's also a discipline-specific phrase or word. Think about that. You know, what else is a doctor going to refer to the government's policy and way of supporting people who are of a certain age, of elderly people? The government program that they use in order to take care of themselves. Well, that's called Medicare, and you're not going to call it by another name, so you need to preserve that. And as we look here, maybe offering the dates is important, or maybe it's not, but definitely offering this 25% concept, that needs to absolutely be represented in numeric form. So if we're looking at the rest of the sentence and we were going to write a paraphrase, in this blank space on your exercise, go on ahead and write your paraphrase and then show it to me. Bring it to me, email it to me, test out your paraphrasing skills as best you can there. Let me also go back to this paraphrase this exercise. Part of the next assignment that you're going to be completing is to actually do the paraphrase this for your writing assignment. And so you need to download that file, and you need to provide a quote, the exact wording from the original quote, and you need to provide that citation at the end. Then you need to take a stab at paraphrasing. And so I've obviously preserved the spaces for you to be able to type your direct quotes and type your paraphrases in. When you do the citation, you're going to provide the same citation that you did for your direct quote, and it has to go in parentheses, and make sure that the paraphrase is actually typed before the citation. If your paraphrase, or if your citation actually comes first before the paraphrase, then it looks like that citation goes with the sentence previous to it. So make sure that you get that right. And notice that the period is after the citation. So you're going to write your sentence or so here. You're going to provide the citation, and then you're going to provide a period at the very end. Okay. Keep in mind that 2-to-1 ratio here, all right, or 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio here. If you have this much cited as a direct quote, when you write the paraphrase, make sure that you keep it just as brief. You keep it very, very similar in size. And think also about, what are my exceptions to the paraphrasing rule? Do any exist in this sentence? No, I need to put it into my own words, and then I need to see if I accidentally copied any words, like we did with citizens and union in the previous example. So this is your assignment. Practice paraphrasing, and we will move on to the next assignment when you're all finished.